Wrong button on my last video. Anyway, so restoration, I don't know if I said this already, but restoration is returning a habitat to its original state. Rehabilitation is kind of like helping it, but it wouldn't be necessarily returning it to its original state. Replacement often is used to put in a biome or biome works here, a habitat that is less demanding than it used to be. So let's say if we had an area of forest that we completely cleared for logging, we would restore it by maybe planting some bushes and some grasses and turning it into a grassland instead. And then artificial ecosystems. So an example of an artificial ecosystem would be this right here. So in this area, they have put up cement barriers, and basically they have a river that's traveling in a very straight line, straight path. But what they've done is they caused the river to have to slow down considerably because it has to move siding going back and forth and back and forth. This way they've extended how much it has to travel. They've slowed down the rate. And then they've also planted all of these plants that can help absorb nutrients, absorb pollution, and so they can actually end up having the water be cleaner as than when it came into this area. So this is kind of an artificial wetland area here. Now, wetlands, I didn't say this before, but wetlands are actually very beneficial because they do help to do a few things. One, and I don't know if this is later in the presentation or not, but one, they help to reduce flooding. So they tend to be an area where excess water can go when there's high amounts of rain. So if you're draining a swamp and then putting people's houses there, that tends to end up having people complain when there's a huge amount of rain, and then we end up having those houses flood because that's a natural place where the water goes. So they help reduce destruction to man-made structures because they hold excess water. Number two, they help slow the water down. Some contaminants will actually settle to the bottom of wetlands and they won't move on further down into the water cycle here or the flow of the river. Plants will also pull up nutrients. They'll remove nutrients. They'll soak up toxins as well. And then they also allow the water to leave the wetland cleaner than when it got there. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that. So aquatic biodiversity, we have aquatic biomes. A lot of people refer to them as this word biomes, but aquatic biomes are not biomes. They're called aquatic life zones. On the test, you'll probably see them as aquatic life zones, but it's possible you may also see aquatic biomes, which you'll probably understand what that means right off the bat. We split this into two categories, saltwater and freshwater zones. So let's talk about different aquatic species in the first place. We've got 4 different types. We have plankton. I'll go back, so don't worry about it, but nekton, benthos, and a last one, which would be decomposers. Okay, so plankton is made up of 3 different types. Ultraplankton, that's really, really small, phytoplankton, and zooplankton. So ultraplankton and phytoplankton, these two here, those produce 54% of all of the oxygen that we have in the world. So like half of the air that you're breathing is, or a little bit more than half of the air that you're breathing, is coming from these tiny microscopic organisms, mainly made up of protists, cyanobacteria. These are photosynthetic organisms that aren't plants, and then some of them are plants. Zooplankton can be tiny little creatures, to all the way to larger creatures like jellyfish. They're more of organisms that aren't strong enough or aren't big enough to be able to go where they want to go under their own will and force. Basically, the ocean currents are too strong for them, and so they kind of go with the flow. So most zooplankton is really, really small. Zooplankton, meaning animals. So we got that zoo prefix there. And so because jellies don't really have enough strength to not to like go where they want, the current kind of takes them, even though some jellyfish can be meters big, they're still considered zooplankton. So these most of them are small, they can be a little bit bigger. Now small babies, so like if you have a tiny little creature, that can also be classified as zooplankton until it gets larger. So that can be like a nursery here for octopus, small octopus, baby sharks. Those tiny, tiny little creatures that start out really small, they can be considered zooplankton until they get large enough. But most zooplankton is just small creatures. Next one here is nekton. Nekton are swimming things. Things that can swim and move along wherever they want to go. So fish, turtles, whales, anything in the ocean, any aquatic life that swims. Benthos are organisms that either are growing on the bottom, are attached to the bottom, or crawl along the bottom. So these are moving things. They can be plants, they can be animals. Maybe a few protists might be in here because some protists behave similar to animals. I guess some cyanobacteria could be concerned as this. But so things like clams, crabs, these nasty tube worms. I'm not a fan of worms. Any kind of aquatic grasses, anemones, those kind of things. Corals, all of the corals would be classified as benthos. And then we have our decomposers. In the waters, that's mostly bacteria. Not too many fungus live underwater, at least not that I'm aware of. So decomposers, we're talking mostly bacteria. So ocean factors determining biodiversity and species evenness. Remember, species evenness is how even the numbers of different types of organisms there are in a ecosystem. So you have 10 angelfish, and you have 10, I can't think of another fish right now, clownfish. They're evenly distributed in their numbers. But things that affect aquatic systems is going to be temperature. Fluctuating temperature is very important for a lot of these organisms. Most of them can only have a small temperature range they can tolerate. DO, which stands for dissolved oxygen. Remember, a lot of this aquatic life has to be able to take oxygen, dissolved oxygen that's dissolved in the water, extract it through their gills to be able to survive. The availability of food, which is a given, and availability of light and nutrients. Now, some organisms don't need any light, like these worms that live on the bottom of the ocean that eat decaying and rotting fish that fall down to the bottom. This is a whale carcass, or I guess used to be whale carcass. This is now mostly a whale skeleton here. Alright, so we talked about coastal zones. Coastal zones are next to the continent, including the intertidal zone, an area above the continental shelf. Alright, so you guys probably don't know what the continental shelf is, so let's talk about that really quickly. So here, this is like, I don't know, New Jersey, or no, this is like South Carolina. I don't know. It's off of the east coast of the United States, somewhere there. Here is the land. This is the terrestrial section. Here is the coast. This, as you can see, is not as deep as the rest of the water. And then you have sort of this drop-off. Along most of the continents, we have this area where we have a gradually sloping downward until you hit this part where there's almost like a big cliff drop-off where we turn into the ocean bottom. This is partially because this rock here is the same type of rock as this rock here, and then when we drop to the bottom of the ocean, the bedrock that underlies the ocean is a completely different rock. So we've got ocean rock here, primarily basalt or gabbro. I don't know if you guys know those rocks or not, but that's what those are. If you've ever heard of black granite or seen someone's black granite countertop, it's actually not granite. They lied to you. It's actually called gabbro, which is rock of the ocean. And then we have here mostly granites and andesites and rhyolites here that make up the continental crust. So this area here that's submerged in water still, but isn't as deep, it's shallow, that is what we call the continental shelf. So here is another diagram of kind of what that looks like. We've got the land here, and then we're going down lower and lower. This area here is the continental shelf. This would be, all this yellow would be submerged in water. And then here we have this continental slope where it drops off pretty dramatically into the ocean. And then here we have the ocean floor. Here's a side view. And we'll draw a diagram, or I'll show you a diagram that you can sketch that will kind of give you this idea. Again, here we have dry land. Here we have what would be called the coastal zone or the intertidal zone. So when people talk about the coast, this is usually what they're referring to. Here is our continental slope. Slopes down pretty dramatically. This is a little exaggerated here. And then we have the ocean floor. All right, so coastal zones also include these things called estuaries, coastal wetlands like marshes and mangroves, barrier beaches, and coral reefs. So let's start with an estuary. An estuary is an area that's sort of partially going to be ocean, but then it's partially also fresh water. We have a mix of water here. So an example of an estuary would be these two photos here. See, we've got the fresh water flowing into the ocean, and we have the ocean water here. This zone here would be considered an estuary. It's where salt water is sort of a mix between the two. Here's a larger example of that. Here we have an estuary here where we're going to have varying amounts of salt water here as opposed to here. Now these coastal wetlands, what defines a wetland is a specific type of vegetation. Vegetation that's specifically well adapted to be able to be completely submerged in water, that it also has some sort of adaptation to be able to get oxygen, because a lot of times in these wetland areas we tend to have low oxygen conditions. So they've got to be able to get oxygen somehow. Sometimes they do that by have adaptive roots that actually go above the water level and are able to get oxygen that way. But these coastal wetlands also have to be able to handle and be able to deal with two things. They have to be able to handle higher amounts of salt than normal plants that are on land. And they also need to be able to be dry at some times, because there's something called a tide. You guys have probably heard of tides, but the water will move in and then the water will move out, and some of these wetlands will have all of this water that we see here in this photo can drain all the way out, and there'll be times where this is completely, well, I wouldn't say dry, but devoid of standing water. Our next type of wetland here is a mangrove. This is a mangrove forest. They happen only in tropical waters, but they're really good at a few things. You should write these things down. They're really good at sort of slowing that wave down, so it prevents beach erosion, because those sediments are kind of trapped. The waves kind of hit these trees, and it's kind of like a buffer zone for them. 2, it reduces storm damage from tsunamis and hurricanes by a large amount. They're also really good for small fish nurseries. Nursery meaning a place for small or young organisms to go to hide, to be protected because of their branches. their trunks and then their root systems help protect organisms. And they also extract pollution or pollutants, and as well as nutrients, excess nutrients that we don't want to get into the ocean, away from getting into the ocean and producing something we haven't talked about in this class called algal blooms. Or something even worse than algal blooms, which is a type of algal bloom, which is like a red tide. Now this video, I don't know if you're going to be able to hear it very well, but I'm going to play it anyway and see how it goes.
Today we're deep in the heart of a mangrove forest, exploring some amazing trees that can survive.
Yeah, that sucks. I'm just going to go ahead and upload that video. So I'm going to stop this video here, and you can watch that video to understand a little bit more about mangroves, and it shows you what mangroves look like a little bit under the water. So I'll just get that in the next video.